this podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
It's Ordinary Means, Part 6, The 5 Points of a Calvinist, or on having a care for visitors.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
The Heidelcast.
I don't remember when I read Jack Miller's 1986 critique of the NAPARC world, North American Presbyterian and Reformed Council world. The book was Outgrowing the Ingrown Church, but I suspect it was around 1990. I was pastoring a small NAPARC congregation, and I'd been charged with helping the congregation to grow, and as a result, I began reading a lot of the church growth literature. And much of it was written from outside the confessional Reformed world, but Miller wrote from within the confessional Reformed world and to the confessional P&R, Presbyterian and Reformed congregations. It's been a long time since I read the book, but I have still two lasting impressions. First, I remember being uncomfortable with some of Miller's prescriptions. He was, after all, the father of the liturgically progressive New Life movement within the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And most of those churches, I think, migrated to the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America. Most of the congregations who identified with that movement, as I say, moved around 1989 or thereafter. And my prescription was and remains that the New Life movement was marked by a certain pragmatic spirit. There was in the movement and in its successor, the so-called Redeemer movement and the other connected movements within NAPARC, a commitment to contextualization that seemed to justify practices that were and remain difficult to square with the Westminster standards, things like liturgical dance or the participation of laity in the leadership of worship services, etc. Second, however, is that Miller knew what he was talking about when he addressed, quote, ingrown, close quote, churches. That's his word. It's this aspect of Miller's critique on which I want to reflect in this episode. Whatever Miller got wrong, and he did get things wrong, one of the things that he got right was that we who would reach the lost must give serious, prayerful thought to loving our neighbors when they seek out and visit our confessional P&R congregations. Giving this sort of prayerful thought toward inviting and welcoming our neighbors to our congregations is not seeker-sensitive, at least not in the way that we normally think of that. That rubric, being seeker-sensitive, is used to justify things that are, as I say, pretty hard to square with what we confess. But there shouldn't be anything controversial about having a certain awareness of seekers as we prepare our services. Now, we're not, forming our services, with the seeker primarily in mind. We are forming our services primarily with God in mind. But even the Apostle Paul, at least had some idea of what he hoped to happen, as he says in 1 Corinthians 14, if an unbeliever should happen into one of our services. So, as I say, the seeker-sensitive movement has too often entailed a theology, piety, and practice that is alien to the Word as we confess it and as we practice it. But what does it mean to love our neighbor as we think about how we present ourselves to the community around us? Now, it's not an exhaustive list that I'm going to give you in this episode, but it is born out of more than 35 years of pastoral ministry. And in that time, I've had opportunity to visit congregations across North America and Europe, and there are some patterns that have emerged that I've noticed. First, does your congregation have a website? This is a kind of a bugaboo of mine. Does it give visitors quickly and easily the information they need to be able to find your congregation, for example, the location and the time, so that they can join your worship service? Does it give directions to your church? Does it have a map of some kind to the church? Those things are very useful. If you'll bear with me, I look at a lot of church websites because people are always writing and saying, hey, I can't find a Reformed church. Can you help me find a Reformed congregation? By the way, we do have a section on the resources page that's intentionally set up to try to answer that question. Go to heidelblog.net/resources, and right near the top is a section on how to find a Reformed church and what to do if you can't find one. And there are a couple of different tools that we link to to help you to be able to find. One that I use most often now is the zip code church finder. Just type in your zip code or the town that you're looking at, and then the site to which it links. It's an app, I guess, that will show you where the NAPARC churches are within 25, 50, or even 100 miles of where you will be, to give you an idea of what's out there. Anyway, I get contacted all the time. Help me find a Reformed church. And so I go and I look at websites. And one of the things that amazes me about church websites is that they tell me all kinds of things about themselves, but they don't tell me what time the services are, and they don't tell me where they are. So please, if you're listening to this and you're not a member of a congregation, why not? What is keeping you from joining or uniting with a confessional Reformed congregation? Please do that. But I assume you're attending at least regularly a Reformed congregation. Go look at your church website and see what it looks like to somebody who's visiting your church for the first time. And does it say right away on the front page, the first thing that comes, when they click, that shows up on their screen, does it show, where you are and what time the services are? And if it doesn't have that information, if you have to fish for it, please talk to the person who is in charge of the website and say, thank you so much for your effort in our church website. I very much appreciate it, because these are almost always volunteer efforts that people do. And say, I noticed this. Can I help you with this? Or is there a way we can make it easier for people to find the address? Can we put the address on the front page of the website? Can we put our service times on the front page of the website? I know one time I called a church trying to find out what time the services were, because the website said one thing and the front of the church said another, and it was kind of confusing. And I called the number that was listed on the church, and I think I woke up somebody. So I felt bad about that. And I thought the number would go to the church, and it went to somebody's home. So I'm really encouraging you to try to look at your church, particularly right now, your website, the way an outsider, a visitor, a guest looks at your church and your website. One can tell almost immediately whether a congregation has given serious thought to the experience of visitors, because it shows on the website, it shows in the bulletin, in the way the church is physically organized, in the way the service is conducted, and in the way that it is explained.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
So if your church has a website, and it should. There are churches I find sometimes who don't have a website. They may have a link to a Facebook page. That's okay. It's better than nothing, but even those are not always very useful. Facebook pages are sometimes hard to navigate, and the information that you need is not always readily available. And so if you're struggling with how to put up a church website, there are ways to do it, relatively inexpensive ways to do it. And I encourage you to check that out. It's not that difficult to set up very quickly and easily a clear and useful website. It doesn't have to be extensive. It doesn't have to be fancy. Just about anybody can set up a WordPress.com site. Now, that will have ads. That's why it's free to you, because it has ads. But you can do that for free, and you could do that in probably an hour or two. It's not that difficult. You can have your own website, your own domain. It will cost a little more. You have to rent space on a server or on a host. But again, it's not too difficult to do. And chances are there's somebody in your congregation who has done this, maybe even does it for a living, and can do it for you. Or somebody will do that for you. And there are services that will do websites for churches too, although I have not always found those to be particularly helpful. But again, can a church visitor find the time and the location of your service on the front page of your website, so that the visitor doesn't have to click through the site and search to try to find it? Try to look at your website the way a visitor does. I'm passionate about this because people will decide right away, and they can tell right away whether you have ever thought about them, and they can tell intuitively. As I say, is there a working phone number on your site? Things like that. Or is the church really only for the people who already attend? And it's really not for anybody else. And they know that. They know that intuitively, because people deal with websites all the time. And there are good commercial websites that are user-friendly, and there are commercial websites that are really only there to sort of harvest information of the visitors and to collect information and to use as a sort of marketing tool. And we all can tell one from the other.
The best podcast, the Hydrocast.
Another question, is your building inviting or excluding? Is your church inviting or excluding? Is it easily accessible to the public? Is there sufficient parking? Is there a decent sign facing the street so that your guest will know that he has found the correct congregation? Is it clear where to go for worship once somebody enters the building? Is it clearly marked which door to enter? You'd be surprised how many times I have entered the church building through the wrong door. The very first time I tried to go consciously as a young man to try to go to church, I accidentally went in the side door. And I've done that more than once. I even did it with Mrs. Heidelkest and the Heidelkinder. We went through the wrong door when we visited Willow Creek, I think, surely that was our fault. I'm sure they had wonderful signage. Actually, at that point, they really didn't. So that's why we ended up going through. So even they got that wrong. So is it clear where to go for worship once someone enters the building? Are their guides as necessary? More than once I've walked into NAPARC congregations during my travels only to find a NAPARC congregation that's clearly unprepared for visitors, or where visitors are even something of a bother. I remember visiting a church one time, it was a NAPARC church, where they had run out of bulletins and they had to quickly make copies for us. We probably really didn't need them. We could probably figure out the service. It wasn't that complicated. But it was interesting that they only made enough for the people that they knew would be attending. So that was a pretty clear indicator that they weren't planning on us visiting. Perhaps it's been a while since anybody visited, and members of the congregation have simply forgotten what that experience is like. As I say, I remember my first visit to a church as a non-Christian. I didn't have any experience with the church and with church buildings. I didn't really even know where to go. And, if you look at a church from the outside, you might be surprised how confusing churches can be to outsiders. They tend to be built over time in stages, and that tends to lead to architectural chaos. As I mentioned earlier, I went through a side door and found myself in a maze of Sunday school rooms, people rushing about. They knew where they were going and what they were doing. And then I ended up entering the auditorium from not directly behind the pulpit, but, from roughly behind the pulpit. Fortunately, the service hadn't started yet, but it was a little bit startling to walk in and face the congregation as they were taking their seats. I didn't mean to do that. I would much rather have entered from the back than from the front, but that's what happens when you have no idea what's going on. So is the front entrance of your building clearly indicated? Do you have greeters assigned to the front and the side doors to guide first-time visitors? Those are all, I think, helpful, useful things to think about. So part of what I'm doing in this episode, I guess, is to say that, we want to be means of grace churches, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a care for visitors. So we don't have to choose between these things. And I think sometimes people think that, well, if I'm going to be really sensitive to visitors, not to be seeker sensitive in that sense, but if I'm going to be aware of visitors, I really can't be, a means of grace pastor, or we can't have a means of grace congregation. I have to choose between the two. So I'm doing this episode deliberately to say that's a false choice. You don't have to pick between the due use of ordinary means and having a care for visitors.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
One of the worst parts about being a first-time visitor to a congregation is the fear of not knowing where to go or what to do or where to sit. And again, more than once I visited NAPARC congregations only to find there's no place for me to sit, which basically tells the visitor, listen, go away. You don't fit here. You don't belong here. I found pews full of Bibles and purses and backpacks. And, the assumption is we all know where we belong. There's sort of limited pew real estate, if you will. And years ago, and maybe you've heard me mention this before, I remember reading or hearing a church growth guru claim that if a church is 75% full, that it's effectively full, and it basically says to the visitor, there's no room for you. And, whether that's true for everyone, when I read that, I remember thinking, well, yeah, boy, that really resonates with me. Now, I'm a guy who was raised where there's a lot of open space. I'm from the plains. And, on the plains, if you don't want to be around people, drive for 5 minutes in any direction, and you will not be around people, very quickly. It's very easy where I'm from to be out in the open and to be not around people. So I get a little itchy sometimes when it's really crowded. So maybe I'm hypersensitive about that, but maybe I'm not the only one. Is there space, for example, in the back for guests? If I'm entering a new place for the first time, I do not want to sit in the front. And I certainly don't want to be introduced to the group, to the congregation. I want to sit quietly in the back. I'm happy to be greeted and to greet people, after the service and that sort of thing. But no one, I think, visiting a congregation for the first time, maybe the second time, or maybe even the third time, wants to make the walk of shame to the front of the church. So guests, especially those who don't attend church regularly, they might even be late. Is there space for them to be seated comfortably and quietly and even anonymously? So I know sometimes we put families with children, noisy children, we put them in the back. But is there some place where we can make a space for visitors who might not quite know what to do? Of course, we're going to meet them at the door. We're going to guide them. We're going to help them. We're going to mark doors and so forth. So that, give a thought. Think about, where are these people going to go? Now, here's another thing to think about. Does the bulletin or the worship guide make sense to the visitor? Now, God regulates the worship service in his holy word. Now, our understanding is that we do only in worship what God has commanded. And this is what Calvin called the rule of worship. And it's come to be called the regulative principle. Right? Originally, it was the regula culti. So hence, a regular rule of worship. Nevertheless, this does not mean that we should speak unintelligibly to outsiders. It's not as if the Apostle Paul didn't address this very issue. This is what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 14, 23 through 25 from the ESV. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in languages, I'm going to revise the ESV a little bit, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your minds? But if all prophecy and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He's called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed. And so, falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. So I take it that Paul is addressing the problem created by the fact that there were people speaking in a number of foreign languages during the service. There's precious little evidence in the New Testament for what's commonly called tongues today, glossolalia. That's a whole different phenomenon, really. And they were doing so without a care for outsiders and or unbelievers. Paul, however, thought about outsiders and unbelievers. He wanted Christian worship services at least to be intelligible to them. And his prayer is that unbelievers and outsiders would hear the law, be convicted by the law, be driven to their knees in repentance and adoration of the God who is holy, holy, holy. That's Isaiah 6:3. Has the congregation given thought to the number of Bibles, psalters, and other worship materials in the pew rack or under the seat? Is the bulletin or the worship guide laid out clearly? Does the pastor explain basic things? For example, where to find the Apostles' Creed? And does he give the visitor enough time to find page 851 in the back of the Trinity Psalter hymnal? So if you're going to say turn to page 851, it takes a moment. Don't just say it's on 851 and then start going, right? You give people a time to get there if they need to get there. Is there an explanation given as to why the congregation does what it does and why? It doesn't have to be lengthy, but again, have a care for visitors. In its interest in reaching the lost, the seeker-sensitive movement gave in to the temptation to let the visitor determine the nature of the service. Sometimes in reaction to the seeker-sensitive movement, some NAPAR congregations seem to have gone out of their way to make the service as difficult and confusing as possible. The claims of postmodernism notwithstanding, the historic Christian understanding of humanity, that's theological anthropology, is that we are rational creatures. Reason is not everything, but it is something. There is a place between seeker-sensitive services and the P&R equivalent of a monastic maze. So let's uphold our Reformed dialogical principle that is, God speaks to us in His Word, read, His Word confessed, His Word preached, and the Word made visible in the sacraments, and we respond with His Word in prayers and song. Right? That dialogical principle is biblical, historical, and sensible. but to let us, however, as we uphold our principle, do so with some sense that we may have guests who may need some help. Not everybody was raised juggling psalters and Bibles in a worship service. And finally, is someone assigned politely to guide and warmly greet guests as they leave? Sometimes people, they just want to leave quietly, and that's fine. They should be allowed that dignity. The church is not a Kiwanis club. It's not a Rotary club. Not everyone needs a slap on the back, but neither should people leave without any acknowledgement that they were ever present. Are there people assigned during the recessional to attend to the exits and to greet and answer questions that may come up? So the principle here is relatively simple. Are we loving our guests? What would we want if we were visiting a PNR congregation for the first time? What can we do within our principles, and because of our principles, to demonstrate love of neighbor to those who visit? Right? These are good and godly questions. The church services exist to glorify God. But we also, with Paul, hope that outsiders will visit and that they will see that God is present among us, and they will fall down and join us in the worship of the risen Christ.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
To this podcast, the Heidelcast.